Good evening, everybody. Thanks for joining us again for the next Armchair Traveler series. Tonight, Eben and Natalie are going to give us a talk. First, I want to tell you a little bit about the Armchair Traveler series. It began like 4 years ago, and it's travel adventures far and near, presented by people from Haines and nearby areas. And it's a way for those of us who can't go do those things or don't have time or don't have the physical capability to be able to experience these wonderful places. So we're going to have this talk tonight, and then we're going to take a little hiatus. Our next talk will be, I think, March 26th, about then. So look for advertising. And then we have 2 or 3 between end of March and end of April. So tonight we have the talk by Natalie and Eben called Skinny Skis in the North, Winter Traverses in the Brooks Range. And I think most of you know Eben and Natalie, and I will just say that they are pretty amazing people and have done amazing things, and they love the wilderness. That's the introduction for tonight, and I'll hand it over to them.
Thanks, Cindy.
Thanks a lot, Cindy. And thanks for bringing all of us out of the woodwork to talk about adventures. Yeah, so we're gonna talk about some 3 ski trips that Natalie and I did in the Brooks Range in the late winter, early spring over the last almost 10 years. Trips are all associated with these wilderness classic races that we'll talk about a little bit. Both of us grew up as cross-country ski racers, Natalie in the Midwest and myself in the East, and developed a love for Alaska, much like a lot of adventurous people from other parts of the country. And so both of our early connections up here were friends we knew from skiing and ski racing. And so I had heard about this crazy point-to-point races, ski races that had happened in Alaska since the early 80s. And I'd had a friend do some. And so at some point I decided I wanted to try one of these races with one of my old ski racing friends. And we did a couple in 2011 and 2013. And then when Natalie and I started doing trips together and then dating, we decided this would be a great fit for us to do one of these type of trips. So a little background on the overall thing. This started in the late 80s with some Alaskan adventurers, just doing an informal group ski that basically turned into a race. They did the Eastern Alaska Range from the Parks Highway, the Richardson Highway. They did, I believe, Eureka to Valdez, Nebezna to McCarthy. So some of these great Alaskan spring ski traverses, they started doing them as races. This is an article from the late 90s. So Natalie and I decided one year, they're super informal event. There's one guy who's an organizer we'll talk about shortly, but pretty much just show up and do a trip. And it's a race, but really it's just an excuse to travel fast in the wilderness with a group of cool folks. We'll assume, oh, I might need to connect to the library. Wi-Fi. Matt,
why not read all together?
While Eben's doing this, I'll talk for a couple minutes. We've been drawn to doing trips in the Brooks Range, both summer and winter, is just by the sheer ease of travel for anyone who's been up there. And the other reason is because I had a lot of interest in continuing to go to that landscape after doing some field work up there. So for several years, I was a wildlife biologist for the Fish and Wildlife Service and was positioned at one point in the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge. And so the trips that we're going to talk about, and we have a quick map, are on both the Eastern Brooks Range or the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge side, so a little over 9 million acres of primarily designated wilderness outside of the 1.5 million acres known as the coastal plain, where oil and gas development is still in consistent debate. And then the Western Arctic, which is a combination of a series of protected lands that include Gates of the Arctic National Park, the National Petroleum Reserve Alaska, which is a Bureau of Land Management designation that was given to that land in 1976 for as a naval reserve, should there ever be a shortage of oil that would be necessary, given what was going on in the 70s with oil shortages. And then also an area called the Kobuk Reserve, which is managed by the Park Service. So that's kind of the patchwork of the landscape that we're going to be talking about. And of course, these are the traditional lands of Northern Yupik and Nupiat and the Gwich'in peoples, which we'll talk a little bit about because we got to spend some time in one of the villages.
Yeah, so since the early days, these races have been associated with Dave Kramer, who runs an engineering consulting rural logistics firm out of Tok. He's been kind of an unchanging force in this organization, this event. This is Dave in his 30s. This is Dave in his 70s this spring. Fairly unchanged, pretty classic, came to Alaska in the late 60s kind of character, and was doing these races himself into the mid 60s, going out with a 100-pound sled into his mid 60s with a 100-pound sled going for 6, 8, 10 days, over hundreds of miles of Arctic wilderness. So anyway, we call up Dave the first year we decided to do a race together, a week before the race, like, hey, we'll see you next week, we're coming up. And he's like, oh guys, I'm really sorry, the race is full. It was the first year they did in the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge, which Natalie had mentioned. So it got super popular, and they had a permit limitation from the feds, so they couldn't allow us to do the race. But we still wanted to see everybody and decided we kind of cooked up our own route in the area. On either side, this is we'll go to a real map later, but this is Natalie's journal map of the route. But the Hall Road, which I'm sure everybody's familiar with from Fairbanks to Prudhoe Bay, goes up and it bisects the Brooks Range north to south. And so we basically started south of the range on the east side.
The journal page seam is
the road.
Hall Road.
So we started south of the range, north of Coldfoot on the and went east through a pass called Ula Pass into the Iktillik River drainage, which is a really neat dry, scoured, katabatic river valley. We'll see some pictures of. Back to the road, which kind of, we were both new to this together, weren't sure how much what our pace would be like together. So it kind of provided us a nice bailout option in the middle. And then we could cross over to the Stag River, which I can't fully pronounce, over a pass into the North Fork of the Chandelar River and back out Chandelar Shelf to the road. So kind of a loop with a road splitting the middle like a butterfly. So we headed out. This is the first pass on Natalie's map, Ula Pass.
Can I say?
Yeah.
So one really interesting thing about this travel, so you see my backpack is pretty small. So we carry at most 30 pounds of gear, and that includes our food, tent, puffy layers, as well as a couple different kinds of emergency kits, both for gear repair as well as for first aid. So the idea is to go light and fast, kind of like moving like an animal on the landscape, which we'll talk a little bit about. And our skis are just very simple Nordic skis, not fish scales. So they're waxable bases, because fish scales can tend to drag, and it's helpful in some cases, as you'll see in the way we travel, to be able to get that glide, especially when we hit patches of ice on frozen rivers. And so the whole kit is actually pretty simple and very lightweight. And so I always think of these trips as like a race against your food bag, because you basically have 6 to 7 days of food, no wiggle room. So you got to hope that, you can do the travel in that amount of time. And that's kind of the biggest risk factor in a lot of ways, is just you don't know what the elements are going to provide. And you have a very limited amount of caloric intake that you're carrying with you. But it also allows us to travel 30 to 40 miles a day because we have a really lightweight pack.
Yeah, and so one of the biggest unknowns in this kind of travel is the speed of the snow. And so, so far you've seen kind of, average, typical, snow depths like you might see skiing around in the woods in the river valley, upriver. But at times this climate can have just really deep, sugary snow because of the cold. And so you're basically skiing on the ground, but the snow could be knee deep, or in some cases even waist deep. And so your speed can go anything from like as fast as you can pull downwind on ice to far under a mile per hour. So it's really hard to scale out how much you might be able to expect to travel in a given day. So now we're heading into the Iktilik Valley. There's a lot of overflow. So, like we're seeing out in the river here, Arctic rivers, as many are familiar, will freeze, and then the pressure of the water will bubble up through, and it'll make these giant lakes. So it can be miles of almost like a Zamboni skating rink, where one pole you can go 50 feet. And if the wind is in your favor, it can be a super fast way to travel and really beautiful. These are similar dynamics which create those big lakes of overflow, create these pressure ridges. So behind Natalie, she's on a flat river. And what you're seeing is like a blue, deep, solid, frozen, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 feet of ice that then, as the water from the current pushes under it, it lifts it up and forms these long bread loaves that might be 10 feet high and 100 yards long. Another really interesting phenomenon in this environment is floating rocks. So the ice can freeze crystal clear, but then underneath there'll be it'll form in like a slush layer, and the slush combined with the current will kind of scoop the rock, like you'll hear sometimes in a fast flowing river, the rocks rolling downstream in a similar pattern, that the rocks will kind of be like moved and scooped up and suspended into this ice and then froze. So then they can freeze, the ice will transform, they'll become crystal clear, and they'll just appear like they're suspended in glass. These are like, coffee table sized rocks that are just floating in the middle of the ice flow or the ice thickness.
And I'm sorry to interrupt, I was late. What month is the?
Oh, sorry, this is late March or early April. I'm not really sure on this one.
Yeah, I think our
Right around the
earliest
March,
trip
April.
started like the March 29th, and I think our latest trip started on the 5th of April. So kind of that.
And the temperature is, in this.
Probably like plus 20 to minus 20. Well, not in this particular picture, it's probably on the warmer end of that. And so, you've seen at that time of year when the sun gets really powerful, how dramatically different it can feel. If there's shade and a slight breeze, 0 degrees can feel like the coldest thing you've ever felt. And if it's, if you've been in some of the colder weather and all of a sudden you get in the sun and the breeze is gone, you can feel like it's really hot out. And then you look at a thermometer, it's still below 0. So, it's kind of this weird time of year where things are imminent. We'll talk about in some of the later trips, like, the meltdown happens at different times and earlier than it used to, but it can feel like the depths of winter, or it can feel just like you could almost feel like you take your, be in a t-shirt. Oh, fast forward, we got ahead of ourselves. So that we're getting down, we've completed the first half of our loop. We're going down this river valley. It's nice traveling, but we'd had a big day. And I had done a hunting trip in this area before and was aware of a cabin out on the land that was, it's a private cabin, but, in that tradition, they're kind of left open in case somebody needs them. So we were about ready to stop, and, it was around dusk, and we decided to push on a little bit to this cabin. I kept promising, like, well, it'll be faster because we don't need to do all the tent stuff. We can sleep in this cabin. Well, we get to the cabin about, of course, the days are long now in April, and we get to cabin a little after dark. It's maybe 10 or 10:30 in the evening, and there's a snow machine out. We're skiing out. We see a little distance. There's a snow machine out front. Like, oh shoot, they're at their cabin. We won't be able to use it. And so we're like, oh, ski by, and we wave, and they're like, come on in. And there was 2 guys named Victor and Rick, and they were hanging out at the cabin, ice fishing and drinking. And we had several rum and cokes and burgers, and watched some 1980s music videos. There was a drunken stumbling event with a freshly opened tin can, after which we were
Not one of us.
not one of us. For the rest of the evening, we were known as Natalie and the finger cutter.
And what's interesting is because we weren't doing the race this year, we were allowed to stop and have drinks and hamburgers, but the rule, and there's not very many rules with the Alaska Mountain Wilderness Ski Classic, is you can't have any additional support unless it's offered to you, in which case, like, you go through a village, and if someone offers you food or drink, you're allowed to take it, but that's the only way in which you're allowed to eat anything supplemented from what you're carrying on your back. In this case, though, I think actually we were offered it anyway, so.
So lots of stories, and one of the lines tonight is the country's filling up. And so we often think of that when we encounter people out in the wilderness. So then we crossed the road, we headed up the river, which was similar, icy, fast traveling, but we knew that sort of the crux of whether or not, now we're down to maybe like 2 or 3 days of food left perhaps to get back to the road, and we don't really have as much, we didn't really talk to anybody that traveled this area in the winter. And so we're really worried about whether or not it's gonna be just super deep snow, because we know as you go to the south side of the range, the snow, it gets warmer, so the snow gets deeper and the travel slows down. So this one pass, we're like, it could be really fast, it could be really slow, and as we approach the pass, we meet the migrating caribou herd that's crossing from the south side of the Brooks Range to the calving grounds. And so we're like, yes, if nothing else, we'll be able to like follow their footprints. And then of course, it was just amazing to have them traveling north while we were traveling fast and south. And, like Natalie mentioned, everybody's kind of like just trying to find the efficiencies of travel and covering ground, and, us for sport perhaps, and them for survival. But yeah, it was just kind of, the more time out there, the more you see the connections and just like the little choices you make in navigation and finding ways to travel.
So this herd, both the Central Arctic herd and the porcupine caribou herd both funnel through the Sag Valley, because it's the closest one next to the Hall Road, and the Hall Road, if the road wasn't there, would still be a major migration corridor and mixing area for both herds. So it's impossible to know if who we were seeing were porcupine or individuals from the Central Arctic herd. But what's really cool is that the way caribou move, the pregnant females are the first ones. They're actually the ones breaking trail. The males come later because the females have to get to the coastal plain. The biological clock is ticking. So they're already pregnant by the time they're making their transition over the Brooks Range, which is just so impressive. So this was my first time ever seeing them in winter. I had done some work with them in the summer months when they're on the coastal plain. But to kind of think about these trench-like trails being dug by pregnant females with, bellies that are getting heavier and heavier while they plod forward to try to get to the coastal plain to eat the cotton grasses that they need to instigate their milk production is pretty phenomenal. So primarily you're seeing the cows and not the bulls. The bulls tend to come later and in smaller groups, and some of them just stay on the south side of the range and don't ever actually go to the north side.
And yeah, so one of the cool things is in places they all like exclusively travel single file, not necessarily here and certainly not in the valley pictures we were showing, but in the more technical mountain passes, they like were places where there was only one track, and that doesn't necessarily make for great skiing. So but all in all, we were able to travel quickly enough into the North Fork over the pass and into the North Fork Chandelar. So yeah, this is probably the high point of land here. Probably, yeah. It's like one. Be heading up to Uktiavik maybe. Or over the pole, I don't know. So yeah, so we're going down the valley and ahead of us and then hooking a right and going back out to the road. And so a lot of the valleys have, big katabatic down valley winds. So they'll have like supportive snow from either be totally wind scoured, and so they can really be concentrators. Like the Iktilik Valley has had a strong sheep population because the winds sublimate the snow away, so they can easily get to dryas and sedges. But then when you get down into the more protected forests, you can see the snow gets much deeper, and this would easily be knee deep or thigh deep snow here. And so you're really trying to stay on the rivers wherever possible. But again, it's kind of getting the south side, so things are warming up, so that overflow doesn't freeze instantly. So it can be kind of a balance between the sloppy river with no snow or snow in the woods. This is an older trip with another friend on one of these type of travels, but like it can be like this for miles. So we try to take steps to try to waterproof our boots with make little these are just Nordic ski boots with a little custom made over boots to Gore-Tex and neoprene over boots to keep your feet dry as possible. Yeah, some more travel on heading into Chandelar Shelf. And then eventually the overflow ran out and we were just kind of slogging along in the deep snow, but there's a German author who goes in here on dogs, or used to, I don't know if he still does, but would go in here to a cabin on a dog sled, and he had passed through like 2 weeks before us, so we could just barely in places find the foot tracks of his dogs, and it was supportable enough to keep us up. So as soon as you stepped off this track, you would be like far deeper.
That's really hard trail
You
breaking.
could just
So
see
you
these
this
little
little bubble track. in the
dots of the
snow.
old dog tracks, and we call them the bubble track. Yeah. Caribou trails and rolling Brooks Range terrain.
I'm a chronic journaler, and so I just put that in to remind myself to tell people that even on relatively stressful trips, you can still carry a journal and take little notes, and it's definitely worth it.
Towards the end, I was kind of wishing that we had the journal's weight of candy, maybe, but. So yeah, this is another trip, 2 years later, setting out on the same route. So from basically where we started the second half of our trip, the goal was to do a longer traverse of almost 200 miles in the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge from the Sag River in Adigan Gorge, north of the east-west Brooks Range. We'll show a map at the very end. But going all the way south to going pretty far east, and then back to the road. And so this time we were formally entered in the Wilderness Classic race. This is the group starting out, and it was pretty deep snow to start out, so everybody was traveling together, trail, because when it's kind of a little weird, and that's why it's not really a super serious ski race about like who won or who didn't win, because if you're in front, you're doing way more work trail breaking, and then everybody behind. So it's a little bit a race, but it's also just a great collaborative, safer way to do a trip with a big group of people.
And the race is usually capped at around 40 people. Is that
Yeah,
right?
at the absolute max.
So that group, almost everyone in this year chose to go on the Arctic Refuge side because it was still relatively novel to be able to travel. It took several years for the race organizer, Dave, who you saw at the beginning, to get the permit to actually do the trip on the Arctic Refuge side. What's interesting, and this is a bit about climate change, is as the climate changes, one of the things that's happening, right, is that the sea ice is moving offshore, creating these open areas of water all winter long. And so as those cold Arctic winds blow across the water, they're blowing across this warm water, picking up moisture, and then dumping a lot of snow in the Brooks Range. So there's a lot more snow even on the north side of the Brooks Range than there used to be, which creates a lot of challenges for caribou traveling. They're slowed down. Their migration over the mountains has often now been delayed year after year because they're waiting for that snowpack to both settle as well as harden. But the deeper the snowpack, the longer it takes to settle and harden. And so one of the issues that's been more and more common also are like more catastrophic landslides because of a deeper snowpack. So in this trip, we all started off together, as Eben said, kind of working as a group. And I'd say we were kind of one or two groups behind the lead pack of guys who we knew, who were good, everyone kind of knows each other in this world. And the first group of guys had skied down a relatively minor pass, but had triggered a relatively large avalanche. And one of them had been caught in it, had gotten out of it okay, but we came upon them and they were kind of shook up. And so we collected as a whole group within about an hour and a half, and all decided to camp because it became very apparent that, and this is just our second day out, that we were just heading into the Brooks Range proper. The snowpack was really deep, and it was unlikely that we were going to be able to find any kind of way to pass through the mountains safely, because you have to do these kind of up and over the Brooks Range. So even if you mitigate every kind of landscape feature the best you can, you're still going to run into some kind of hazard related to avalanches because you're moving through a mountain system.
Yeah, and it's from being, alpine skiers and ski mountaineers, it's a little different type of avalanche calculation, because normally we go out in the mountains and we maybe try to make a decision about a certain slope, and if we don't like that one, we go to a safer one, or but on these long trips, most of the terrain is quite flat, like flatter than Haynes Pass, or the very most rolling parts you might travel through going up to the Yukon. And but there'll be these sections where to continue on your route, you need to go over a small pass or through a train trap or a narrow section of ravine. And without that, you don't really have, there is no other option. These routes kind of are architected to take the, as you choose different routes, so that the race doesn't have a defined course or anything, but there's, pretty natural valley driven routes where you could practically do the route and point to point in the amount of time you have. And so you could get in a situation where you've gone for 3 days of travel and then you've reached a pass where if you pass over the pass, you have one more day of travel to reach your destination. But if you can't pass over, you can't go anywhere. So you have to go back. And so it kind of, becomes limiting, but in a large scale.
So we camped as a group kind of in these river flats, and so we're kind of in the headwaters of what's the Ribden River, which is one of the main rivers that flows north from the Brooks Range. Second night, and most of the group decides to go back. There's about 4 or 6 of us. Six of us that decide, well, we're out here, we have 4.5, 5 days of food left. We might as well make a trip out of it. So what can we do? And so we look at the maps and we're like, oh, one of the options would be to just bail
All
on the
right, so
course.
for anybody who missed a bit there, we decided not to complete the original route, which would have returned to the Dalton Highway, and instead go to Arctic Village, which is 100 miles or so east of the highway, off the road system, set on the south side of the Brooks Range, in a group of 6 folks. And so again, kind of the constant vein of deep snow and just slow trail breaking. Sugary snow. But then eventually we caught up to the caribou herd, and this would be the porcupine.
Before you get there, what's that thing on your back?
Oh yeah, so you'll see in a variety of these photos, like people with their sleeping bags on their backpack. And so it's just kind of, anybody who's winter camped, you're familiar, you wake up covered in frost or your bag is wet. And then with these down bags, anytime they get a little bit wet, they just get colder and colder and colder as the down shrinks down. And so throughout the day, we're usually trying to dry out all our various parts. So it kind of looks like a yard sale. Fortunately, often the weather up there is stable and nice out.
So the south side of the Brooks Range, just south of Arctic Village, again, wherever there's villages, there's caribou in the north, is one of the main areas where porcupine caribou herd. So we're fully in porcupine caribou herd territory. It's one of the main areas where they hang out for the winter. And so they're in boreal forest, and you see all that, all this churned up land is basically them scraping the snow away to eat lichen. That's their primary winter food, is the lichen that's found in boreal forest ground cover. And because there's so many caribou, we were able to pretty solidly follow caribou tracks the whole time for the last few days, which was nice because it was really deep snow where the caribou hadn't traveled, and really sugary snow. But the caribou trails are really lumpy, and they're very hard to travel on in their own way. So it's kind of like, imagine styrofoamy snow that then is frozen hard in irregular shaped lumps, and you're on little skinny skis, and so you're kind of balancing on like rocks the whole time. And I put in a little video, but I'm not sure if it will work. But that's the group of us that decided to go over the mountains into Arctic Village. And so when we got to Arctic Village, we were a bit of the talk of the town. These people just showed up. Yeah. So this is the visitor center. If you ever go to Arctic Village, they've got some great maps of the refuge there. What was funny is, like, we were coming into town and I ran into a guy who was asking where we came from, and I said the Hall Road, and he was like, and I was like, yeah, from the Hall Road. And then we came up Smoke Creek, and Smoke Creek's only 20 miles away. The Hall Road is 100 and some miles away. And he's like, oh, Smoke Creek, that's really far. And it made me think, like, when you're from a place, right, you have all those landmarks in your mind, the ones that are that are there because you've gone there and you know how far it is. And then you have something like the Hall Road, which is like 100 and some miles away and just like not really in your daily thoughts. And so the fact that we came from Smoke Creek was way bigger of a deal than the fact we had come from the Hall Road.
Yeah, or like how road centric most of us, our maps of Alaska are, whereas, a lot of other times in places they're, river centric maps. So anyway, we asked around and were invited to stay in the community center. There was like, we could wait a few days and fly a scheduled flight. So we had ended up having a few days to hang out, and we're like, hey, we'll get to just see what life in Arctic Village is like and meet some folks. So promptly, of course, we've been out on a trip and we're pretty hungry. So we set up shop in the around the stove and, hit up the village store and ate an insane number of $18 frozen pizzas. And just kind of big disappointment was we missed radio bingo. We were invited to play a radio bingo game where everybody plays bingo, on the radio from house to house, but due to lack of a running snow machine to deliver the cards, the game was we were falling asleep around like the 8 p.m. bedtime, and the game was, slated to start around 9:30, so we were already staying up pretty late, and then eventually the game got canceled, so next time.
It was really great though. Like, we were invited over for a birthday party. I got to go to church. I forget the name of this person. He's in the Gilbert family. Trumbull Gilbert's a well-known elder from the community. This was one of his brothers, but he showed me the caribou meat shed. So they were starting to get caribou for the season, and they can leave it outside just above ground because it's still cold enough in the spring to do so. So this was his meat shed that he let me see, and this was the dumpster behind the community center with a little piece of caribou. And this is just a video to show you the travel route that we did for this particular trip. There was a great map in the visitor center.
The avalanche happened where the finger is now, and then we found a way to cross over the Continental Divide that was safe, and now you can see we're just on these more major, safer valley river systems, whereas otherwise we would have been forced to head further through the mountains.
So that trip was about 165 miles, we thought, 165, 170. And it's hard to tell because there's so many squiggles when you're on the river. Their estimate.
And then, final trip we wanted to talk about was one we just did this spring. So that one's finished, and then so this spring, all these trips are kind of starting. It's kind of cool, like kind of to explore deeper within like a general area and see the diversity within, like a relatively small part of the state overall. And so this one is starting, so that was sort of the east side of the Hall Road, and this is on the west side, leaving on the north side of the range, traveling through the mountains.
From Galbraith Lake, which is on the north side of the Brooks Range, to Anaktuvik Pass, the village, and then from the village go over the Brooks Range to the south and eventually back to Wiseman. So a bit of a horseshoe, leaving the road and then coming back to the start.
Gates of the Arctic National Park, the North Fork Koyukuk River, some of the area that Bob Marshall explored, and the Muries.
This is also a big one because it was the last Alaska Mountain Wilderness Ski Classic that Dave Kramer was willing to organize. So he's been the one for the last, 30 years that's been putting these together. And is obviously a legend for many of us, and just one of those people that has bootstrapped this relatively low-key event that not very many people know about. As Eben said, Dave came to Alaska when he was younger. He actually rode his horse from Michigan to Alaska, and thus built a life here, doing primarily rural engineering projects around the state. And Dave was hoping desperately that a group of us younger folks would take over the baton and organize these events. And there's several of us that hope to in the future, but just have a little too many commitments right now to do it. But this group of people represents a lot of folks who have done these trips for a long time and just really loved and appreciated the work that Dave did. So for a lot of us, it was a way to really celebrate his legacy as well.
Yeah, you can kind of see here the diversity of like the skis are all pretty typical, like metal edge Nordic skis. But there's a bit of a spread of what people use for boots. A lot of people use plastic randonnée ski boots because they're just more durable and they have the removable liners and maybe better waterproofness and overflow, but they're quite stiff and hard to walk in. So kind of the classic boots for this type of travel is a 3-pin duckbill, leather boots, which still people use. They are one of the more also a durable option, but they don't have very free stride. And so when you're just walking all day long, the kind of the motion of having your toe
And we've
locked
used
to
them a lot.
locked to the
but-
ski. So our first two
Two
trips
trips.
were on those. And then this trip we're using a new system that has like a pin style binding in the soft boots. But yeah, so it's kind of you see some of the different footwear there. And so when I started doing these trips maybe 15 years ago, a lot of people were still using sleds. I think you can just see one sled there, but as outdoor gear has gotten lighter and sort of travel techniques and the confidence that comes from GPS and satellite navigation and communications is kind of giving people a more courage to go fast. It's definitely a lot easier if you can just ski with a pack in the 30 to 40 pound range. So the sleds have kind of disappeared over time. Whereas if you look at some of the old pictures of these races, everybody's pulling sleds.
Basically, we just have a heavy caribou belly. It's just on our back, not on our bellies. And so we start out again as a group from Galbraith Lake. Is pretty cold. This trip, I think our coldest night got down to -23, and it was pretty chilly on the north side of the range for this first day. A group of us were interested in doing a slightly different route through the Brooks Range on this trip. So we were also kind of piloting a new route that hadn't been done as part of one of these prior courses. And what typically happens is just even throughout the beginning of a first day, a bit like a string of caribou, you kind of end up falling into smaller and smaller group sizes, plodding your way through the snow. We did run into a few smaller groups of caribou that were already making their way over the range onto the north side of the mountains. So this is still on the north side, kind of just getting to the foothills of the Brooks Range.
Quick question,
Yeah.
how much fuel are you carrying to melt snow for water?
So also on the gear, some people use the canister type stoves. And those, there's a lot less fiddling. But the canisters you need to be kind of warm, keeping them warm in your coat. And then when they start cooking, they go, or when the gas starts evaporating, they cook colder. And so you either need to somehow actively warm the stove by exchanging some of the heat from the fire into them. Or just switch canisters constantly. So the white gas stoves are a little bit more like heavy but solid options. For the white gas stoves, I think a big part of it is trying to go light on the fuel. And so this is actually a great time to ask that question because you can see the edge here. There's a little bit of overflow seeping out. And so we're constantly trying to get water, also partly because of fuel use, but also because of the time of melting snow that kind of cuts in your time to sleep. So we're always trying to scoop up water whenever we can. And so this is very likely like some fresh overflow that just came out. And so you'd kind of go in with your little cup and fill up your water bottles and then generally fill up your water bottles and then put on all your clothes and then drink as much as you can really quick. Cause that, if you imagine drinking a liter of ice cold water really drops your body temperature. So then you want to start skiing, you don't want to go drink an liter of water and go to camp. So I think like
It's our total.
When I was doing the canister stoves, like 3 of those 8-ounce canisters for 6 days and not using them all. So and then for ounces of white gas per person, maybe like 4 ounces per day.
3 per person? Or
3 cans per person, yeah.
3 cans per person.
With like a pocket rocket style stove, so a less efficient stove and people to use the reactors
So
or
better than the whisper light.
just trade-offs.
We-
Yeah, on this trip we
use-
use the Whisper Light.
Yeah,
Otherwise,
we
we
use-
use a lighter one called the Simmer Light, which we didn't have. Our normal winter camping stove has the winter winter seals and stuff in the pump, and the stove we brought on this trip didn't have the right O-rings for winter time, so it was like
Our
leaking
first
gas on us all
two-
the time.
Our first two trips, we did the canisters, and Eben had this little trick where it a small piece of copper and a little insulative ring that we'd put around the canister, which the idea, I mean,
So the copper
you have
would
to
go
be
in the flame and
careful
keep
that
the,
it doesn't
keep
heat
the
it up too
canister-
much, but it would kind of
to
heat the
keep
canister up.
The pressures up.
So we did that for the first two trips, and then this one we carried the simmer light because it ended up not being a whole lot more weight, and it's just like you don't have to deal with the worrying about the canisters. Otherwise, you're sleeping with the canisters and trying to keep them warm all day while you also have your water bottles in your jacket.
Are you preheating that with the alcohol gel with your simmer light and stuff, or you just like?
Just lighting the fuel, yeah.
You're just lighting the fuel?
Yeah.
This is getting into the first set of passes that we went through, and it was just really cool, narrow.
Lime Stack Peaks, I forget the name of that valley.
I don't remember. Forget. And what's cool about the Brooks Range for those of you that have traveled there is like most of the passes go. So you kind of go into it knowing, unlike even here when we're doing trips in our own backyard, we're still like, ooh, yeah, that didn't work out the way we thought. But in general, the Brooks Range is pretty friendly. Even the more choked the valleys get, you can usually find a way. And so even though these creek valleys were kind of tricky or some ice waterfalls to get up, there were nice snowbanks on the side and a few little technical sections. We do carry little lightweight grippers in case there's ice.
But no avalanche gear, and in this kind of really rocky thin snowpack, like being an avalanche would not be much fun. So this particular pass was like just barely. The avalanche conditions were pretty bad, but we were in it kind of got low visibility, but it was just barely enough terrain features where we could travel through the pass on safe terrain, like little benches and stuff.
And we had a small group again of about 6 of us, including, well, 2 guys that from Colorado that's kind of glommed on, but 4 of us that had done several of these trips, including a friend of ours that had been I had been in the one valley in the summer and he had been on this side in the summer. So it's helpful to also just kind of have that knowledge of what the landscape looks like in the summer when you're trying to navigate it. But basically a series of benches and some slopes above you. We have little kicker skins that we've just cut out of skin material that slip on our skis and go the full length of the ski. In some cases, I think you use ones that go 3/4 of the length of the ski. So that's how we're able to stick when we're climbing up.
But then most of the time we're kicking and gliding skiing, we're using kick wax. Just because the fish scales and skins are a lot slower, and you're really just trying to milk out every little bit of glide over the day.
So this is coming down through that technical section, entering the Anaktuvik River Valley, which flows, the Anaktuvik River flows from Anaktuvik Pass, which means caribou poop in Inupiat.
Likely grabbing some, you can see little tracks there where somebody was getting some water. So yeah, so people use, I've done them with no tent in a warmer sleeping bag. The floorless mid style teepee shelters are popular. We've taken to using this tent weighs like 1.9 pounds. That's just mesh, but it's kind of nice having a floor and a little bit more tent, but still, everybody's shelters are pretty minimal. So we try to camp in copses of trees, little willow patches and stuff if we can to block the wind, because a lot of times the wind can be pretty in the areas. Anaktuvik Pass is an area where they would spend time in the summer caribou hunting, and then it was maybe not the best site for when they got sighted as a village. It's just really windy in the wintertime.
This is headed into Anaktuvik Pass, which is and it's in a pretty high, very windy place. It's a Nunavut Inupiat community, traditionally migrating community of folks that would move between the coast and the interior. And this was, as Eben mentioned, a summer village, but is now year round. Do you have any pictures? Yeah, here's the picture of coming through town. So the checkpoint at these races, there's a checkpoint at the halfway point, and this one happened to be at the school. So what was really nice is we were coming into the school while school was still happening. And again, when you come into a small community with ski gear on, looking like a bunch of weirdos, you tend to be the talk of town. So we had some lovely teachers who took us in and let us sit in the teacher conference room and gave us lunch. The cook who was there had extra food, and so we were able to eat food. We didn't ask for the food was given to us, so it wasn't breaking the rules. But we were able to spend about a couple hours there drying out, getting warm, because it was really windy and cold coming in. It had been really cold the night before. And this is headed out of Anatuvik Pass. What was kind of nice is for folks that have to drop halfway. That's a nice halfway point because there is jet service in and out of Anatuvik. So some folks were able to leave. And so now we're headed over kind of the second band of the Brooks Range on the south side, about to climb our final set of passes for the trip.
This is going into the Tiana Pass. These are kind of unnamed creeks above Anatuvik Pass, and then we'll cross the Continental Divide and head into the south side of the range into the Tianaguk River. And again, like as soon as you cross that Continental Divide, there's just a really marked shift in climate. There's trees, like spruce trees, and the temperatures get a lot warmer. The Tianaguk River actually ended up having pretty deep snow and a lot of open, like it would have in past years when people have done this, that skied down that river at this time of year is solidly frozen, but we were dealing with a lot of open areas and holes. So we had a great kind of ski down this long, probably 2-mile long gully, which, in backcountry ski touring skis would have been pretty mellow terrain, but on little cross country skis, it was a lot of fun. Then we settled into what was 2 or 3 days slog out the river. So again, like we kind of split up into little groups of 2 or 3, spread out over a day, but then pretty readily when we hit the deep sugar snow, the
There's
kind of packed back up into a group of maybe 10 people skiing in a line during the trail break-in duties.
I was realizing when we were putting the slideshow together for you guys that we don't have any photos of when the snow is really deep because it's a bit of a suffer fest and no one's taking photos. But yeah, for about 2.5 days, we were like the guys were about waist deep, and like for me it was sometimes up to here in sugar snow. And so the best way to do it was to all get in a line and have the person in front breaking trail. What we eventually figured out was without your pack on, so you could actually like do it without sliding backwards, because you're pushing through this layer of styrofoam snow on top and then just like endless depth of powder. And so it worked out better to drop your pack, go up front, break trail, and then peel off, let everybody else go, ski back, get your pack, catch up, and by that time, like you'd get back into the rotation. And so by the end of it, for this year, I think in total there was 13, about half the folks dropped out, and so there was like 13 to 14 people that ended up finishing, and like 11 of us all took the same route, and there was a big group of like 9 of us that were just in this line together for 2.5 days breaking trail, which is nice and makes these kinds of trips a little bit more fun than if you're just out there by yourself, not part of an event for a while. Because when we did it by ourselves and hit those kind of conditions, you're just kind of always worried about whether or not you're gonna make it out before the food bag is done.
So still out order. That's kind of still going down to the Tianaguk. Yes, it's the Tianaguk River, soon joining into the North Fork of the Koyukuk, which comes down through the gates of the Arctic.
The river, we were expecting to hit more ice than we did, but again, just with climate change, the snowpack in the Brooks Range is really starting to ramp up, and so we actually didn't hit much ice. The ice is nice because it lets you move several kilometers at a time much more quickly than just plodding through snow. But eventually on this, our last day, half a day, I guess we hit a snow machine track that kind of took us back toward Wiseman. So made
I've
for
always
easier
thought it's
skiing.
kind of funny that we mostly go to these places to escape, the impacts of man and to find, kind of untrammeled wilderness. But then as soon as there's an ATV trail through the brush or a snow machine trail in the snow, we're like laser beam for that. So yeah, after a few days out, the idea of getting back a day sooner, it's like, all right, I love this trail.
That was the crew that all came in together, and that's our buddy Josh.
It's warmed up a ton now. It's probably getting in the upper 20s, and
That's kind of what your feet look like afterward. This is
these are
this is
for
a
the
bad
people
one.
wearing like the Dina Fit
The
boots.
Dina Fit boots are
a lot better.
notoriously painful on the feet. I pre-taped with Lugo tape my whole foot, so I didn't put my photos in, but like last spring, they actually did a cool study. So the military's been doing studies for the last few years on folks that do these events. And so they did data collection of us like before you go, and they do, body mass index and fat content and like the weight that you're going to carry on your back, overall body weight. They do all these comparative diagnostics between when you start and when you come back, like how much weight you've lost, how much of that was body fat, what your muscle mass is down to. Because just in 1 week of being out there, like your body transitions pretty intensely. And so I had to go, you have to strip down and get weighed. And I took off my socks and my feet were just fully wrapped in this stuff. And they were like, can we see your feet like without the tape on them, thinking they were going to be as bad as that photo. And I took the tape off and they looked fine. So my advice for anyone doing winter trips where you're going to put a lot of miles on your feet is there's this stuff called Luco tape that, physiotherapists, physical therapists use. And it's really nice for taping your feet. I use it on summer trips and winter trips. It's just like having a whole layer of skin over your feet. Because I get pretty bad blisters otherwise.
So this is just kind of a multicolored artist rendering of like give you some context of where we are. So, Fairbanks down here at the bottom, Prudhoe Bay, Barrow, Gammock, and then the Brooks Range, kind of the, northern range, and the road roughly goes up through here somewhere. And so this is the Sag River. So that first trip, we, started on one side of the road, went to the west side, then back down to the east side. This is like Coldfoot and Wiseman. The second trip, the plan had been to do something more like this back to Wiseman. And then instead we went over to Arctic Village. And then the third one starting on the north side, a little bit south of here, actually we're strong, but like starting on the north side, going out to Anaktuvik Pass, and then returning the Tanakuk River and North Fork Koyukuk comes down here back to Wiseman area. So roughly where we're at in the state.
Yeah, and so my favorite takeaways from these trips have been just the simplicity of travel, just the movement out as an animal. You're just an animal, right? You got what you got with you, and you kind of got to figure it out as you go. And in the times when we've been doing them with other folks, just the camaraderie of that travel in a small group. And then what's been really beautiful about it is like when I was a young college student, I did some work in Washington, D.C., and a former senator of Alaska would famously, talk about how the Arctic was just this barren wasteland, a blank sheet of paper is what he would say. And I've seen it, having studied it in the summer, I knew that at least there's life in a seasonal capacity there. But what's been really cool about these trips is just the sheer amount of life that's there in the winter and spring. Like you're seeing these caribou movements that are, the only reason caribou exists, they're, the longest migrating mammal on the planet. And the reason they exist is because they have a landscape large enough to support a migratory species that requires something very certain in this time of the year and a different kind of thing in the other time of the year. And so you have that motion happening on the landscape, but then with the caribou are wolf tracks. Like we were always following wolf tracks, and occasionally a spring bear, so many ptarmigan, like Koyuktuk Creek in our first trip, we scared up ptarmigan for a whole day. And down on the south side of the range, you'll see a lot of lynx tracks associated with some of those ptarmigan groves. And lots of spring birds that are already pulsing up in early April, late March. So it's just like this incredible landscape, and to see it in that glimpse in late March, early April is really neat because it's on the cusp of that massive transition that's taking place. And then we don't take any photos of it because we're typically asleep. But when you do get up in the middle of the night, for any reason, you look outside, it's just like always these amazing light shows happening. Someday one of my dreams is to do one of these trips and ski at night when you can do it under the northern lights, but so far I've just wanted to sleep. That's all we had. Yeah. Thanks.
Thanks for coming. Hopefully, yeah, we try to do, different size trips of every year, but kind of spring ski trips. Definitely a tradition. These ones make it great to like fit a month's worth of traveling into, if you have a week off from work, it's pack a lot in, but maybe not, well, definitely not one of these races. And maybe we also do a lot of more classic kind of ski mountaineering or backcountry skiing and mountains. So this Nordic style travel is only one way to explore, but it's really well suited to this terrain. It has a lot of avalanche hazard and a lot of broad horizontal landscapes.
Yeah, it's we'll do some kind of trip. We might not go back up to the Arctic this spring. It's hard to pull it off every year, and these trips take so much preparation. Like when you're out there, it's just so simple. You're just getting up, you're moving, you're eating, you're moving, you're eating, you're moving. You're never stopping unless you're like also going to the bathroom, also drinking, also eating, and then you're just moving again. So it's like this is very simple process when you're out there, but it's like weeks to prepare for it. So we do them every few years, and it's like, okay, we'll do one where we can carry a slightly heavier pack.
You guys freeze dry your own food or?
We dehydrate our own food. Yeah, we don't have a freeze dryer. But yeah, so I just do like meal planning, and I'm, picky about what we eat. So I try to do like a little balance of, protein, carbs, fats to the best you can dehydrate fats, which is kind of limiting. So I'll do dehydrated dinners, and then we don't really eat breakfast, but I'll make like a dense cookie, like a shortbread kind of cookie, and then just eat snacks during the day. And part of that is we don't want to have to boil a ton of water in the morning. So try to do no breakfast, just hot drinks, with some calories in those, and then like a cookie kind of breakfast, and then just boil at dinner. So I have like just a little vacuum packer that I vacuum pack those dehydrated meals with. So they're a little heavier than like freeze dried meals, but that's okay.
Weight wise, we shoot for like 2 pounds of food a day, but really calorie dense foods like sugars and fats, and so a lot of purchased food ends up being junk food, but then we try to have some of our meals be a little healthier.
Natalie, could you talk a little bit more about what you said, your body changes? I can imagine you lose weight, but and I saw the foot. But like what's other things, like do your eyes go bad from like too much sun? Anything like that?
Haven't really noticed any impacts to, with eyes. Like definitely we wear like glacier goggles when we're out there for sunlight, because it is pretty bright when the sun's out, as you can see from the photos. But the only other change is I was surprised at the change in body mass index, like your fat reserves, the drop from, I think I measured in at like 22% when I was going into the race last spring, and I came out at 14%. So I lost a significant amount of body fat in that 1 week, which seemed kind of crazy, but I think that's,
I saw a question about calories.
How many calories?
Yeah, so
yeah.
it's a little hard to say with our homemade food because we try to make it as energy dense as possible. But when when I started doing these types of trips, we would shoot for 4 calories per gram. Foods that had that, which if you look at, you can read the nutrition labels, that pretty much is like sugar and fat. Like cheese does, only the densest cheeses like or driest cheeses like Parmesan will have that. Like a string cheese or mozzarella be maybe half that. And so and then roughly 2 pounds per person per day, which is still about what we do. So that works out to about 4,000 calories per day, which is, you know, probably not a ton more than we would eat. You know, I don't know what I eat normally, but I bet I eat 4,000 calorie dinners sometimes, you know, or like days at least. So it's not insane, mostly because of the weight, and you're definitely trying to, it's for me, starting doing these types of things when I was in my late 20s, now being in my early 40s, like it's been a massive change in how much food I need to eat. Like I was just hungry all the time when I was younger, and now I can do a lot less food, and definitely Natalie eats a lot less food than I do. So just kind of your metabolism can be adjusted. And that's kind of the connections to the animal world, like just really feeling that, you know, efficiency and, you know, how you kind of just try to keep things going at a steady pace instead of being wasteful in all your motions. There was a question about the sun, I think. It's, you know, just sunscreen and hats and bandanas. I think the cold and the sun and the wind all balances out so you don't feel it, and you know, you come back and you're all sunburned and lip cracked and stuff. But yeah. The elevation, there's no elevation, whereas, you know, a glacier trip, you might be on a glacier at 10,000 feet and or you know, 8,000 feet, and so you're at least you don't have the elevation factor. And still at that time of year, it's not full summer sun. Any other questions?
How do you dry out? Wet.
Yeah, it's pretty dry environment in general, even if it's
Where do
snow.
you fall in?
Oh, if like, so hopefully those gators have, for the most part, kept our, yeah, they've done a pretty good job of keeping our feet dry. I haven't we
Try
haven't
not
had
to fall in.
subversion of
People
things.
who do fall in, just dry out the best they can, and you know, put your clothes
But-
back on and start skiing. And you know, the air is dry, and you know, things do dry out. But yeah, just
Anything that needs drying, we just
somebody
kind of
gets
put
their
on our
sleeping
bed
bag
during
wet,
the
you
day
just
to
don't sleep as much.
get warm. And if it's snowy that day, you just kind of leave it packed in, and just being packed in your bag, it kind of dries out a little bit just because the air is dry, even if it's snowing there. So it is a lot, you know, a lot drier than
Yeah.
even the drier travel here.
Just yeah, and just like doing winter stuff outside, you know, any amount of time, you know, you can kind of just adjust your layers and your pace to try to avoid getting really sweaty. So that's, you know, just managing your overall kind of moisture. Overall, it's a big part of just learning to travel in the winter.
You ever find like hunting parties or other like the local people around? Or
In proximity to villages,
they're not out doing crazy things like that.
yeah, it's not prime hunting season. You know, it's probably after you know, after the fur season, like probably fur is kind of past prime or seasons are closed. So yeah, it's a nice time. It's a really nice time to be out on land, but there's just so much Alaska, and you know, only so many of us that are out there. And some of these areas it's just not, you know, it's not really practical to get there without being out on a multi-day trip, you know, many day trip. So
Yeah, it's like you tend to pick up people on the near the road at the beginning, and then near the villages in the middle or at the end. But in between that, there's like tends to be this period of time where you don't see any tracks or any cabins or in holdings or anything.
Thank you, guys.
Thanks.
yeah,
Thanks for coming.
Before everybody leaves, I just want to say, and maybe people have more questions after I'm done, but thank you, Natalie and Eben. Those photographs were amazing. Some of them are just they should be up on the wall in a museum or something. But so thank you for that. And also, I know how much time it takes to put these things together, and I know you guys are both super busy. So I just want to extend my appreciation and everybody else's for doing this for us. So thank you.
Same to you. Thanks for
Yeah,
organizing
thanks
this
for
awesome.
organizing.
We like watching all the other people, so
Yeah.
Yeah.
happy to share some adventures.
Okay. Well, thanks again.